Picture this. A young girl stands in a dimly lit corridor deep within the Persian royal palace. Her hands are trembling. Her breath comes in short, shallow gasps. The air around her is thick with the scent of myrrh oil and heavy incense. But beneath those expensive perfumes, there's something else. Fear. In just moments, she'll enter a room where the most powerful man on earth is waiting. A man who commands millions of souls from the mountains of India to the shores of Greece. A man who believes himself to be not just a king, but a living god, the earthly manifestation of Ahura Mazda himself. But here's what makes this moment different from every other story of ancient power you've ever heard. Here's the detail that turns this from a tale of political intrigue into something far darker, something that ancient historians could barely bring themselves to whisper. The man waiting for her in that chamber, the man she's been prepared and perfumed and dressed for, is her father. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The story that Greek historians whispered about in fragments but never dared to write down completely. The story that has been buried for over 2,000 years beneath the golden dust of empire. The year is 465 BC, but we're not standing in the magnificent colonnaded halls of Persepolis that you see in history books and museum exhibitions. We're not in the grand throne room of Susa where ambassadors from 100 nations once brought tribute. We're somewhere much darker, much more hidden. Deep beneath the surface splendor of the palace lies the royal harem, the private sanctuary they called the Artabanus. And if you think of a harem as some kind of exotic pleasure palace from the Arabian Nights, erase that image from your mind right now. Think of it instead as a prison, but one lined with silk and perfumed with the finest oils from Arabia. Imagine walking through endless corridors of polished cedar wood, imported at enormous cost from the forests of Lebanon. Imagine inner courtyards where sunlight struggles to penetrate, filtered through layers of silk curtains until it takes on a sickly, amber quality. Imagine chambers so thick with the scent of myrrh and incense that the air itself feels heavy, suffocating, hard to breathe. The walls are decorated with intricate mosaics showing scenes of royal hunts and divine favor. The floors are covered with carpets so expensive that each one represents the annual tax revenue of an entire village. But for all this luxury, for all this display of wealth, this place is fundamentally a cage. Inside these walls live hundreds of women. Not wives, not in any meaningful sense. Not quite prisoners, though they can never leave. Something in between, something for which our modern language doesn't quite have a word. There are princesses from conquered kingdoms, daughters of defeated kings sent to Persia as living guarantees of their father's continued loyalty. Hostages dressed as brides. There are daughters of Persian nobles, offered up by ambitious families to secure their position at court, to guarantee their access to power. There are dancers from Egypt, musicians from Babylon, concubines from every province of the empire. Each one represents a conquest, a treaty, a political calculation. Each one is a living trophy of the empire's reach and power. But who actually controls this labyrinth of beauty and desperation? Who administers this golden cage? The eunuchs, men who have been surgically castrated, stripped of their ability to father children, and with that ability, stripped of any loyalty to family or lineage of their own. Their only family is the empire. Their only father is the king. They are the administrators of this system, the record keepers, the spies, the enforcers. They control everything. Who eats and what they eat, who receives gifts of jewelry, who wears which silks, who gets summoned to the king's private chambers. And most importantly, they control who survives and who disappears without a trace. In the harem, silence isn't just golden. It's the only currency that truly matters. A woman could have beauty, intelligence, musical talent, skill in dance or conversation. But without the ability to keep silent about what she sees and hears, none of those gifts will save her. One wrong word, one jealous whisper to the wrong person, one moment of defiance, one flash of rebellion in her eyes, and she simply disappears. The other women wake up one morning and her sleeping mat is empty. No trial, no explanation, no body. She's just gone, as if she never existed. And everyone knows better than to ask questions. This is the machinery of absolute control, refined over generations into a perfect instrument of domination. But to understand how it became something even darker, we need to go back further. We need to understand how this nightmare was built in the first place. When Xerxes inherited the throne from his legendary father, Darius the Great, in the year 486 BC, he didn't just inherit an empire. He inherited the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Indus Valley to the borders of Greece, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. But more than territory, he inherited a system, a machine designed over decades to concentrate absolute power into the hands of one man. Darius had been a genius of organization and administration. He had divided his vast empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who reported directly to the king. He had built a network of roads that allowed messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks rather than months. He had standardized currency, established a professional bureaucracy, created the most efficient military machine the ancient world had ever seen. And at the center of all this, supporting it, justifying it, making it all seem natural and inevitable, was the royal harem. The harem wasn't about pleasure. Not primarily. Oh, it served that function too, but that was almost secondary. The harem was fundamentally a political weapon, a tool of control. Every woman inside represented something. A peace treaty with a former enemy. A conquered territory acknowledging its submission. A noble family kept in check. Their daughter held hostage against their loyalty. It was diplomacy through flesh. Statecraft through intimacy. The most personal expression of the most impersonal calculations of power. Women would arrive at the harem from every corner of the empire. Some came willingly, or at least without open resistance, their families seeing this as an opportunity for advancement. Others came as captives, torn from their homes after their kingdoms fell to Persian armies. All of them went through the same process. They were bathed in perfumed water. Their hair was styled in the Persian fashion. They were dressed in silks and taught to move in certain ways, to use their eyes in certain ways, to speak in soft, modulated tones. They were taught music and dance. They were taught the arts of massage and the preparation of various perfumed oils. Some were taught to read and write, to discuss poetry and philosophy, to be companions as well as concubines. It was a transformation, a breaking down and rebuilding of identity. You entered as a princess of Lydia or a merchant's daughter from Babylon. You emerged as property of the Persian king. Your old life, your old name, your old family, all of that belonged to the past. Your future, if you had one, lay in catching the king's attention and holding it. And the competition for that attention was absolutely fierce. Imagine being one woman among hundreds, all beautiful, all skilled, all desperate. Some women formed alliances, creating small networks of mutual protection. Others competed ruthlessly, spreading rumors about rivals, bribing eunuchs for information or favors. A whisper at the right moment, a piece of gossip delivered to the right person, could elevate a woman to the position of favored concubine. A wrong look, a perceived slight, could mean death. It was a world of silent conspiracies, of smiles that concealed daggers, of friendships that could turn deadly in an instant. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing decades later, described it as a place where women fought each other with weapons more subtle than swords but just as lethal, where poison was always a possibility, where a woman could be strangled in her sleep and her death attributed to natural causes, where the real battles for power happened not in throne rooms, but in scented chambers behind silk curtains. And then something happened that the architects of this system hadn't fully anticipated, or perhaps hadn't cared about. Children began to be born inside the cage. When a concubine in the harem became pregnant and gave birth, the child's fate depended entirely on one factor: gender. If the child was a boy, particularly if he was one of the king's earlier sons, his future was relatively secure. He might be raised to govern a province, to command an army, perhaps even to inherit the throne. A royal prince had value, had a clear place in the machinery of empire. But if the child was a girl, that was different, that was darker. When a concubine gave birth to a daughter, that girl's fate was sealed from the moment she drew her first breath. These daughters of Xerxes, biological princesses carrying royal blood in their veins, grew up within the same walls that imprisoned their mothers. They never left. They never saw the world outside. And unlike the daughters of Xerxes' principal wives, the daughters born to recognized queens who might be married off to foreign princes or powerful Persian nobles as part of some diplomatic arrangement, these girls born in the harem had no such prospects. Their position floated in a terrifying gray area. They were carriers of royal blood, but they were considered part of the harem's collection, part of its inventory, no different from the jewels and silks stored in its treasuries. From their earliest childhood, their entire world was this labyrinth. They learned to walk in its corridors. They played in its inner courtyards. They watched their mothers and hundreds of other women living in a state of perpetual anxiety, always waiting for the king's summons, never knowing if it would come. They breathed the oppressive atmosphere of rivalry, jealousy, and sexualized submission from infancy. It shaped them the way water shapes a stone, slowly, inevitably, completely. These girls were indoctrinated in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend. They learned to walk in certain ways, to hold their bodies just so. They learned to speak softly, to lower their eyes at the right moments, to smile in specific ways. They learned to apply makeup and oil, to dance and sing. But above all, beneath all the specific skills, they learned one fundamental lesson: absolute obedience. They were taught that their bodies didn't belong to them. Their bodies belonged to the empire, and the empire was embodied in one man, the king, their father. Think about what that does to a child's mind. Think about growing up in an environment where the man who fathered you is also the man who owns you, who can command you, who has literal power of life and death over you. Where everyone around you, every adult whose behavior you learn from, treats this as normal, as natural, as the way things simply are. There's no outside perspective, no alternative model of how the world could be. The cage is your entire universe. Meanwhile, the man who had fathered these children was changing. Xerxes, in his early years as king, had been ambitious, energetic, determined to surpass his father's achievements. In 480 BC, he had launched a massive invasion of Greece, leading what ancient sources claim was an army of over 1 million men, though modern historians think the real number was probably closer to 200,000 or 300,000. Still, it was the largest military force ever assembled up to that point in history. He had bridged the Hellespont with boats, creating a pontoon bridge across which his army marched from Asia into Europe. He had dug a canal through the Athos Peninsula to avoid the storms that had wrecked his father's fleet. The logistics alone were staggering, the ambition breathtaking. And then it all fell apart. The Greeks, outnumbered and divided, nevertheless managed to hold the narrow pass at Thermopylae long enough to buy time for their cities to evacuate. The Persian navy, despite its numerical superiority, was outmaneuvered and defeated at the Battle of Salamis. Xerxes, watching from a throne set up on a hillside overlooking the strait, saw his ships rammed and sunk, saw his carefully assembled fleet destroyed in a single afternoon. And then, the following year, his army was defeated on land at Plataea. The invasion that was supposed to cement his legacy, that was supposed to prove him greater than his father, had ended in catastrophic failure. Something broke inside him after that. He returned to Persia, and instead of planning another campaign, instead of trying to rebuild and learn from his mistakes, he turned inward. He had tried to conquer the outside world and failed. So he would focus on the one world he could completely control, his palace. And within that palace, the harem. This is where the psychology of unlimited power begins to rot from within. Here's the thing about absolute power that most people don't understand until they see it up close. When you can have anything you desire instantly, gratification becomes meaningless. When hundreds of the most beautiful women in the empire are willing to submit to you without question, beauty becomes trivial. When submission is automatic, it loses its flavor. The forbidden becomes mundane through familiarity. Absolute power, when it reaches a certain point, no longer seeks satisfaction in any normal sense. It seeks transgression. It needs to cross new boundaries, to violate new taboos, just to feel that it's still absolute, still unlimited. It's like a drug addict needing ever larger doses to achieve the same high. Power needs to prove to itself that there are no limits, no lines it cannot cross. Greek historians, particularly Herodotus, recorded the early warning signs of this corruption. They told stories about Xerxes becoming obsessed with his brother's wife, Amestris. When she refused his advances, he diverted his attention to her daughter, his own niece, and forced her into a relationship. Other accounts mention his interest in the wives of his generals and advisors, sometimes demanding that they be sent to him, sometimes seducing them through a combination of gifts and implied threats. Pattern was forming. The boundaries of family, the lines that marked who was available and who was forbidden, were beginning to blur in the mind of a man who increasingly believed that his will was equivalent to divine law. If he wanted something, then by definition it was right for him to have it. His desires were not subject to human law, because he himself was the source of law. Other men might have fathers and brothers and daughters who were off limits, but he was not other men. He was the King of Kings, the ruler appointed by Ahura Mazda himself to govern the earth. And slowly, inevitably, his attention turned to his daughters. Not the daughters of his principal wives, who had official status and political value. The daughters born in the harem. The ones who had never left its walls. The ones who existed in that gray zone of royal blood and harem property. The ones who had been raised, whether anyone acknowledged it openly or not, for exactly this purpose. Now, let me be absolutely clear about what we're discussing here, because this isn't easy territory to navigate. Even in ancient times, in societies with moral codes vastly different from our own, father-daughter incest was recognized as the ultimate taboo. In Egypt, yes, pharaohs could marry their sisters. Brother-sister marriage was practiced to keep the royal bloodline pure. In Persia itself, there was a custom called zwidoda, consanguineous marriage, which could permit unions between cousins or even half-siblings for the same reason. The logic was that royal blood was so superior to common blood that it shouldn't be diluted by marrying outside the family. But father and daughter? That was different. That was the line that even pharaohs didn't cross, that even Persian kings with all their claims to divine status had historically respected. Why? Because the father-daughter relationship represented something fundamental about the organization of society itself. The father was the protector, the daughter was under his protection. To violate that relationship was to attack the very foundation of familial order. It was chaos, it was the overturning of nature itself. For Xerxes, by this point in his psychological deterioration, that was precisely the attraction. Breaking the supreme taboo proved that he possessed supreme power. It demonstrated that he was truly above all human law, all natural law, perhaps even divine law. It was the one act left to a man who possessed everything, the one thing that could make him feel he was still taking something forbidden rather than simply consuming what was already his by right. The Greek historian Ctesias, who served as a physician in the Persian court years after Xerxes' death and claimed to have access to Persian royal archives, hinted at the depths of this corruption. His works survive only in fragments, quoted by later writers, but those fragments paint a picture of moral collapse so complete that the darkest acts became routine within the palace walls. He describes a court where traditional boundaries had dissolved entirely, where the king's will was the only law that mattered, and where that will had turned toward increasingly transgressive expressions. Think for a moment about the psychology of the victim in this scenario. How do you refuse a man who is simultaneously your father, your king, and your god? A man who has literal power of life and death over you? A man who, with a word, could have you executed, or worse, could have your mother executed while you watch? You can't refuse. The concept of refusal doesn't exist in this context. There is no consent because consent implies the possibility of refusal, and that possibility simply doesn't exist. These young women had been conditioned since birth for this. Think about that word, conditioned. We use it for animals, for training dogs or horses, but here it applies to human beings, to girls raised in an environment specifically designed to break down their autonomy and rebuild them as objects. The entire system, the architecture of the harem with its isolated chambers and hidden passages, the hierarchy with the eunuchs at every level controlling access and information, the education these girls received, the examples they saw every day in the behavior of their mothers and the other women, all of it was designed to deliver them to this moment. Submission wasn't a choice they made. It was an installed function, programmed into them so deeply that it became part of their identity. To refuse would have meant not just defying the king, but defying everything they had been taught about who they were and how the world worked. It would have been like asking them to refuse gravity. For Xerxes, this represented the ultimate form of possession. And I want to be clear that we're not talking about lust here, not in any simple sense. This was about something darker and stranger. This was about solipsism made flesh, about a man who had become so isolated by power that other people had ceased to be real to him in any meaningful way. They were extensions of his will, components of his world, no more capable of independent existence than his furniture or his clothes. Using his own daughters was the ultimate expression of this worldview. It was a man consuming his own creation, completing a circle of control that began with the act of fathering them and ended with possessing them sexually. It was the final proof that his dominion had no limits, that there was nothing in the universe that didn't exist solely for his use. The eunuchs knew what was happening. The servant girls who prepared these young women knew. The mothers knew, and that knowledge must have been a special kind of torture. To have carried a child, given birth to her, raised her, loved her, and then to watch her be prepared and perfumed and led away to the chambers of the man who had fathered her. To know exactly what was about to happen and to be completely powerless to stop it. To know that any attempt to protect your daughter would result in both of you being killed. And they were all silent, because in the harem, silence was the only survival strategy. The system had been perfected over generations to ensure that no word of what happened in these private chambers ever reached the outside world. Guards who were deaf-mutes were stationed at certain doors. Eunuchs who showed any sign of moral qualms disappeared as quickly as disobedient concubines. The architecture itself was designed to muffle sound, to create zones of perfect secrecy. And beyond all these physical measures, there was the simple psychological fact that no one who spoke out survived long enough to speak out again. As Xerxes descended deeper into this private world of depravity, the empire outside began to show cracks. Provincial governors, the satraps, started to abuse their power more openly, knowing that the king's attention was elsewhere. Tax collection became more corrupt. The army, which had been the pride of the empire, lost its discipline and morale. Soldiers who had once believed they were part of a divinely ordained mission now saw themselves as servants of a corrupt and distant ruler who cared nothing for them. The great building projects that Darius had initiated and that Xerxes had continued in his early years slowed and then stopped. The royal road system fell into disrepair in some provinces. The flow of tribute from distant territories became irregular. The Persian colossus that had terrified Greece and conquered Egypt now staggered under the weight of its own corruption, its own internal contradictions. But Xerxes, once obsessed with military conquest and the expansion of his empire, now neglected everything except his private kingdom of horrors. The harem that had been designed as a symbol of Persian power and reach, that had been a tool of diplomacy and control, had become a tomb for his sanity. And inside that tomb, countless young lives were destroyed in ritual silence. Daughters that history would never name, would never acknowledge, would never mourn. Ghosts in their own home. Anonymous victims of power's inexorable logic. But here's the thing about systems built on fear and secrecy. They always collapse eventually. You can build walls. You can post guards. You can kill anyone who speaks out. But you cannot ultimately prevent the truth from leaking out, cannot prevent the corruption from spreading, cannot prevent the system from devouring itself. The year is 465 BC, 20 years after Xerxes returned from his failed invasion of Greece. 20 years of increasing paranoia, increasing cruelty, increasing isolation. The place is Xerxes' own bedchamber, deep within the palace at Susa. The Persian elite, the generals and nobles and administrators who actually ran the day-to-day operations of the empire, had seen enough. They had watched the empire decline. They had seen corruption spread like rot through wood. They had heard the whispers about what was happening in the harem, whispers that even the most sophisticated system of secrecy couldn't completely suppress. And they had decided that Xerxes had to die. The main conspirator was Artabanus, the captain of the royal guard. Think about that for a moment. The man charged with protecting the king's life, the man who had sworn the most sacred oaths to defend him, had concluded that the only way to save the empire was to kill the man at its center. Artabanus was no common assassin. He was a high-ranking noble who commanded the loyalty of the elite guard, and he acted in complicity with a high-ranking eunuch named Artabanus, one of the administrators of the harem itself, a man who knew intimately what had been happening behind closed doors. One night, Artabanus entered the royal quarters. The death was quick and brutal. No ceremony, no trial, no public accusation. Just a blade in the darkness and the wet sound of steel entering flesh. The man who had believed himself a god, the man who had violated every natural law and considered himself above every human constraint, died as men have always died, bleeding, mortal, weak. The forced silence of the harem was broken. Women who had lived for years in muffled quiet suddenly heard screams echoing through the corridors. They heard the clash of metal on metal as guards fought each other, some loyal to the dead king, others to the conspirators. They heard running footsteps and shouted orders in the darkness. Blood stained the expensive Persian carpets, soaked into fabric that represented years of tax revenue from entire provinces. Chaos seized the palace. In the hours and days that followed, different factions fought for control. Xerxes' son Artaxerxes, perhaps part of the conspiracy or perhaps simply opportunistic, moved swiftly. He blamed his older brother Darius for their father's murder and had him executed immediately, eliminating a rival and consolidating his own claim to the throne. Other potential rivals disappeared in the confusion. Bodies were found in courtyards and dumped into the Tigris River. The transition of power, as always in absolute monarchies, was written in blood. And the women of the harem? Those hundreds of lives, those thousands of hours of suffering? They weren't freed. Liberation wasn't even considered. They were simply transferred from being the property of a dead king to being the property of the next one. For the shattered daughters, for the young women who had been used by their own father, there was no justice, no acknowledgement of what had been done to them, no counseling or healing or even recognition that they had been wronged. Just a new master, a new set of chambers to wait in, a new man who might or might not continue his father's practices. The machinery of the harem remained intact. The eunuchs kept their positions. The walls stayed up. The system continued because the system was never about Xerxes as an individual. It was about the concentration of absolute power, and that hadn't changed. One man had died, but the structure that had enabled his crimes survived him. So what did Xerxes leave behind? What was his legacy? He didn't leave a stronger empire. He left an empire that had been humiliated militarily by the Greeks, that had reached its zenith under his father and begun its irreversible decline under his rule. Within a century and a half, Persia would fall to Alexander the Great, its cities burned, its system of government dismantled. He didn't leave architectural marvels that survived him. Oh, the buildings were there. Persepolis with its magnificent columned halls, Susa with its glazed brick reliefs. But they were hollow shells hiding rot, magnificent facades concealing the corruption within. When Alexander's soldiers finally sacked Persepolis, they found in the royal treasury the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of conquest. But they also found, if the surviving accounts can be trusted, evidence of the depravity that had consumed the dynasty's final generations. Xerxes' true legacy was the curse of absolute power itself. The demonstration that human beings, when granted unlimited authority over other human beings, when freed from all constraints and accountability, will descend into bottomless cruelty. That power at that level doesn't elevate you to godhood. It strips away your humanity, leaving something monstrous wearing a golden crown. Here's what haunts me most about this story, what keeps me up at night after researching it. We don't know a single name, not one daughter, not one victim. We can reconstruct the system. We have accounts from Greek historians who heard rumors and fragments. We have archaeological evidence of the harem's layout and operation. We have later Persian texts that hint at the corruption of Xerxes' later years. But we don't have names. We don't have stories. We don't have even one voice speaking directly from inside that nightmare. They exist only as whispers in the texts of their enemies, as anonymous statistics in the accounting of power's true cost. They are ghosts in the historical record, present only through their absence, their silence more deafening than any scream. History was written by the victors, by kings and conquerors and generals. It was recorded by men who had access to literacy and leisure, who served the interests of power. It was never written by the victims, never recorded by the women locked in the harem, never told from the perspective of daughters used by their fathers. The stone walls of Persepolis have fallen. Alexander the Great burned them in 330 BC, whether in a drunken rage or as a calculated act of revenge for Persia's earlier destruction of Athens, we're still not entirely sure. The cedar beams rotted. The silk curtains crumbled to dust. The perfumed oils evaporated. The golden treasures were looted and melted down and redistributed. The physical harem is gone, erased by time and conquest. But invisible harems are still being built around us. They arise wherever power concentrates absolutely, wherever transparency is systematically denied, wherever a group of human beings is stripped of their autonomy and treated as property. The architecture changes. The justifying ideology changes. The specific forms of abuse change. But the underlying pattern, the fundamental dynamic of unchecked power consuming the powerless, that remains constant across millennia. This isn't just ancient history, safely distant and irrelevant. It's a warning that echoes across 2,500 years. It tells us that the darkest crimes don't happen on battlefields under the open sky. They happen in sealed chambers, in private spaces, in places specifically designed to be invisible to outside scrutiny. They're protected by silence, by the complicity of systems that benefit from keeping secrets, by the calculated destruction of anyone who tries to speak out. And it tells us that power, when it becomes absolute, doesn't just corrupt in some vague, abstract sense. It destroys specifically and methodically. It creates machinery designed to facilitate atrocity. It builds walls and trains guards and establishes hierarchies all calibrated to enable the powerful to prey on the powerless while maintaining a facade of civilization, of legitimacy, of divine right. The Persian Empire presented itself to the world as the pinnacle of civilization. Greek visitors who came to negotiate treaties described the magnificence of the royal court, the sophistication of Persian administration, the wealth and artistry on display. They were impressed and intimidated and sometimes envious. But behind that magnificent facade, in chambers those visitors never saw, young women were being systematically destroyed by the man who had fathered them, and an entire system existed to make that destruction possible and keep it hidden. So I want to ask you, what other crimes have been buried under the golden dust of palaces? What dark truths about ancient dynasties, about medieval kingdoms, about more recent empires has official history tried to erase? How many stories like this one are still waiting to be told, still buried in fragmentary sources and whispered accounts and the architectural remains of places designed for secrecy? Drop a comment below telling me which hidden stories you want us to investigate next. What dynasty's secrets should we excavate? What rulers' crimes should we drag into the light? History wasn't written by its victims, but it's our responsibility, here in the present, to find their voices in whatever fragments they left behind, to reconstruct their stories from the silences in the official accounts, to insist that they mattered even when the powerful wanted them forgotten. If this video made you think differently about ancient power, about the gap between official history and hidden reality, about the ways that systems can be designed to facilitate and conceal atrocity, then share it. Help us reach more people. Help us expose the corners that empires always wanted to keep secret. Because the past isn't past. It's not some dead thing that happened long ago and has no relevance to us now. It's a mirror showing us what human beings are capable of, both the worst depths of cruelty and depravity, and also, hopefully, the wisdom to recognize those patterns and resist them. The specific details change. The technology changes. The ideology changes. But the fundamental dynamics of power, the ways it corrupts and consumes, those remain constant. We can't save Xerxes' daughters. They've been dead for 2.5 millennia. Their names are lost. Their voices are silent. Their suffering is over. But we can remember them. We can refuse to let the system that destroyed them have the final victory of making them completely forgotten. We can insist that even anonymous victims of power, even people reduced to statistics and whispers, still matter. That their lives had value. That what was done to them was wrong, even if the perpetrators had all the power and authority and divine mandate in the world. That's why we tell these stories. Not because they're pleasant or comfortable or easy to hear, but because forgetting them, allowing them to remain buried, would be a final victory for the systems that created them. The walls of the Persian harem have fallen, but the pattern those walls embodied keeps trying to rebuild itself over and over in different forms. And the only defense against that pattern is memory and vigilance, and the stubborn insistence that no amount of power justifies atrocity, no matter how long ago or how far away or how different the culture.